So this is my post-fight reaction vid to Andre Ward versus Sergey Kovalev. Depending on how we get on, I'll also cover Paul Smith versus Zeuge in this video. So, you know, first things first, I'm a bit late to the party here. At the time of recording this, it's Monday evening. It's about 9 o'clock on Monday evening. Obviously, a fight took place late Saturday night, early Sunday morning, however you want to look on it. So, I'm a bit late to the party. I woke up and I was surrounded by outrage about this Andre Ward fight. I think there was outrage for two major reasons. Firstly, there was outrage for the stoppage. And the time that the ref decided to step in and wave the fight off, the majority seemed to believe that it was a very premature stoppage. Secondly, for Andre Ward's conduct during the fight, specifically repeated low blows, or the perception of repeated low blows going into the fight, or sorry, throughout the course of the fight, that led to the state Sergey Kovalev was in the last round, hence forcing supposedly premature stoppage. So a very, very, very controversial fight. We'll try and address that later on in the video. This was one of those rematches where when the first bell went, it was round 13. And I know that's a bit of a cliche in boxing, but I genuinely believe that was the case in this fight, certainly. The bell rung, and for me, the action kind of kicked off to an extent where it left in the end of the first fight. I felt that some of the fear factor from Sergey Kovalev had dissipated, especially based on the fact that Ward had weathered a few storms and had, you know, gone the distance with him previously and been able to get a decision. Kovalev started the fight as the aggressor. He was the come-forward fighter. Clearly, he was riled up in the build-up to this fight, and I wonder whether or not he was looking to come out and hurt Andre Ward and put a statement out early in the fight. And certainly, he won the first round on my card, and you know, was quite competitive in the early rounds of this fight, forcing the pace, throwing a lot of punches, and you know, really having some effect in the fight. And it was a weird fight because I kind of had the impression, and I know I'm not the only one who was saying this, that whilst I was scoring the rounds, you know, maybe I'll give that one to Ward, maybe I'll give that one to Kovalev. You know, whilst I didn't have Andre Ward surging ahead in this fight, I personally was under the impression that watching it, yeah, from the early stages, I thought the writing was on the wall for Kovalev, actually, and I thought the fight looked like it was heading in Andre Ward's direction. And I felt that way despite the fact that I was scoring rounds to Sergey Kovalev. Andre Ward, for me, showed in this fight why he is such an effective fighter. We've known for some time how well-rounded he is. Here we saw him adept on the outside, as well as doing what he does best on the inside, roughhousing, spoiling, nicking rounds from the inside. But from the outside, I thought he really showed that to an extent he had worked Kovalev out. He was making Kovalev look very, very inaccurate at times. There were times that with his upper body movement and, you know, with his head movement, Ward was making Kovalev miss, and miss badly at times. I certainly remember 5 or 6 punches in a row that, you know, Ward was able to sort of bob and weave and dodge, and, you know, there was a lot of inaccuracy creeping out from Sergey Kovalev. I even felt at times in this fight, Andre Ward was actually out jabbing Sergey Kovalev, which I thought was very, very relevant from the outside. Ward looked quite slippery and defensively capable on the outside, but at the same time, he was landing very, very effective counter-punches. You know, now a lot of this has been kind of forgotten about because of, you know, the low blows, which we've seen time and time replayed on Twitter and Facebook, whatever. But if you look at the amount of punches that Ward was landing on Kovalev clean, you know, I know Ward's not the biggest puncher in the world, but these were some heavy punches that Kovalev was eating to his chin. You know, I was seeing Ward time him and counter him with right crosses, hooks, everything. You know, for me, it was you know, it really looked like Ward was starting to put his nose in front at the time of the stoppage. And I do think Kovalev was starting to tire. Now, one could argue, of course, that the punches that Ward was landing on Kovalev that were supposedly low had a huge effect in him tiring. But I think Kovalev set a very aggressive pace early on, and I think he was getting countered regularly and routinely, and he was forced to be quite inaccurate. He was forced to chase for large portions of this fight, and you know, Kovalev's a big guy. He cuts a lot of weight to make 175. I do think he was starting to tire, and as he was starting to tire, you could see Ward's effectiveness increasing and increasing and increasing, because Ward wasn't starting to tire. And for me, as we got to the second half of this fight, Ward's jab was even more of an effective weapon. Ward's counter-punching and his timing of those counter-punches was absolutely spot on. And you know, I was really impressed by Andre Ward in this fight. We could talk about the stoppage, we could talk about the low blows, all you want. But what I will say is, regardless of how that fight ended, after round 7, how many of you guys would have legit picked Kovalev to win that fight over 12? You know, did he look like knocking out Andre Ward? Not to myself. Did he look like outpointing Andre Ward? Not to myself at that point in the fight. My opinion, do I think the stoppage was premature? Yes, I do. If we take the belief that those punches were legal, or that the referee believed that they were legal, I still think it was a premature stoppage. You know, Kovalev looked like he was tired. He looked like he was hurt a little bit, but did he look like he was about to get horribly knocked out? Not for my money. I do think it was an early stoppage, but I do think Kovalev was in trouble. And it's one of those where, even though I personally wouldn't have stepped in to call the fight at that particular point, who knows? Who knows? You know, if it had gone on for another, I appreciate it was probably towards the end of the round, but if the fight had continued within that manner, maybe Andre Ward would have been able to force what would be considered a legitimate stoppage. As for the punches on the belt, what do I think of those? You know, I've seen a lot of nonsense on Facebook and stuff about how Sergey Kovalev was repeatedly hitting the balls. You know, if you look at these boxing shots, often you can see that the belt on the boxing shorts is nowhere near that area. You know, boxers wear their shorts very, very, very high. And whilst Andre Ward's punches did appear to stray low on several occasions, and I'm not going to justify that for whatever reason, for me, it didn't look like any of those punches were landing, you know, where Sergey Kovalev's knackers were, let's put it that way. It looked like they were landing on the belt and that Kovalev's shorts were up by his waist, if that makes sense. But realistically, you know, Ward clearly had you know, he was clearly sailing close to the mark. I think he described his you know, the punches himself as borderline, if I'm not mistaken. You know, it seemed to be his tactic to try and work the body of Sergey Kovalev, and you know, maybe he did jump low a few times, and that has understandably left a bad taste in people's mouths. People think the stoppage was too early. People think that Ward showed bad sportsmanship. But I've got to admit, putting all that you know, in the pot, I was still left with the impression that Ward was the better fighter out of the two. I think Ward was landing his jab more effectively towards the end of the fight. I thought Ward was showing superior stamina. I thought Ward was making Kovalev miss. I thought Ward landed the more notable and more memorable power punches. I thought Ward's counter-punching was on form. And I thought Ward looked like he was coming on stronger of the two. You know, I'm not saying Sergey Kovalev shouldn't have been allowed to continue. But my perspective here is that Ward would have gone on to take that fight regardless of whether the referee had stopped him or not. You know, you guys who've been long-term viewers of this channel will know that I'm a big Andre Ward fan. He's not someone that I'm a fan of in terms of I follow everything he does and I love watching him fight, but I think he's the definite pound-for-pound #1 in the sport. I think his resume is really, really strong. You know, he absolutely cleaned up at 168, won the Super 6, won the most sort of well-known tournament in boxing over the last few years, stepped up to 175 pounds and took on a guy who most people, including myself, considered near the very top of the pound-for-pound list. A feared, ferocious puncher with elite boxing capability. Ward's been in with the ring with him twice. and he's emerged victorious both times. Now, people will debate the manner of those wins. People will say that the fights were close. But sure, if you step up to the weight division above your weight class and you fight a guy who is considered one of the top fighters in the world, don't be surprised that the manner of victory is close and controversial, because Sergey Kovalev is a very, very, very good fighter. And for me, Andre Ward proved he could work him out, and did very well in that fight. So I give Andre Ward a huge amount of respect. Ward's one of these guys who's got a little bit of everything in his game. He's not the biggest power puncher, but he is someone who is really well-rounded. He is someone who can offer many, many different looks, and who genuinely can adapt, which is an overused term sometimes in boxing. But I think Ward showed that in this fight. So I give Andre Ward a huge amount of credit. I think he's one of these guys who could retire undefeated. Sometimes I just look at Andre Ward and I think that he's someone who there isn't necessarily an answer to beating him. I think I find it hard to pick a winner. People are saying Adonis Stevenson, people are saying Artur Beterbiev. I wouldn't confidently pick anyone at 175 or 168 against Andre Ward. I just think he's too experienced, too solid, too well-rounded for me at this point. One way that he may get beaten is if he keeps stepping up in weight classes, though, because he was talking about having a fight at heavyweight. And I know Dwyer's mentioned this a few times in the past, and think that he could probably outbox some of these big heavyweights. But heavyweights these days are freak specimens, 6'6", 6'7", 250 pounds, 260 pounds. For me, the phrase "there's weight classes for a reason" comes to mind, and Andre Ward is a guy who was a strong super middleweight. Could I see him in the ring with an Anthony Joshua? No, it's a step too far. Size is too, it's just too dramatically different. We've seen Joshua in with big heavyweights, and he's made them look very, very small men in the ring. So against a guy like Andre Ward, I think it would be one of those where even if Andre Ward was taking punches on the guard and on the gloves, the speed and snap and power and weight behind a 17, 18 stone power punches would be too much for him to weather. Personally, that's my perspective on it. Is he a better technical boxer than Anthony Joshua or Deontay Wilder? Absolutely. Would that be enough to get him a win at heavyweight? Absolutely not, for my money. But at 175, at 168, I find it hard to confidently pick anyone to beat Andre Ward right now. A guy who's an underrated fighter. He may not be the most instantly likeable personality. He may not be the most memorable, eye-catching fighter. He may sometimes fight dirty, and he may sometimes have to steal rounds and scramble around to steal, to get wins. But he's effective. He's very hard to beat, and I think he's got an all-time great resume. Actually, I think his resume is only improving. I think he's pound for pound #1. I think he has been for quite some time. And I think he's very much a Hall of Fame resume. And all the respect to Andre Ward for taking a fight with Sergey Kovalev in the weight class above, making a rematch with Sergey Kovalev, and for getting the nod both times. Paul Smith versus Tyrone Zeuge. Terrible, terrible, terrible fight to watch. And it was frustrating. Paul Smith, I'm afraid, brought very little to the table. I know Paul Smith is another guy who gets a lot of stick. I met him last year. I thought he was a really, really nice guy. Despite his persona sometimes, he was very nice in person. A lot of time for the fans. Very polite guy. And, sometimes you like to see someone like him do well. And I was rooting for him when it came to this fight. But he was wholly outgunned. He lost wide to Tyrone Zeuge, and he really looked a long way past it. The ambition seemed to be out of his game, and he didn't really have anything. Zeuge didn't look fantastic, but Smith didn't have anything to compete with, in terms of athleticism, technique, power. I mean, Smith really didn't seem to have much at all. You kind of wanted to see him try and do something a bit different, try to vary things up. He was just standing at that range with Zeuge, where they were both sort of in range, and Smith was getting out jabbed, he was getting out landed, he was getting out thrown, both in terms of quantity and in terms of quality, and it was frustrating. The commentators were saying, why doesn't he back off and let Tyrone Zeuge come in and maybe miss and create a counter-punching opportunity? I'd like to have seen that. I was more inclined to think, why doesn't he try and go in? Why doesn't he go in against a younger, less experienced guy and try and rough him up on the inside, try and use some sort of veteran skills, try and close down the gap so Zeuge's jab, which was probably the best punch in the fight, was being used less regularly? Why didn't he try and do that? Why didn't he try and take some of the space and distance away from Zeuge and try and put punches together to the body or up the middle on the inside? It's madness to do something wrong and to do it over and over and over again for 12 rounds. And I thought from the second half of this fight, he was really just hoping and praying a haymaker was landing. But he wasn't even putting himself in the right positions regularly enough to have a realistic opportunity of winning this fight by a knockout haymaker. I thought he needed to do something different. He couldn't find that on the night, and whether it was backing off and making Zeuge come in or going to Zeuge and closing down the gap, there was just a lack of any variation, a lack of any plan B, and it was frustrating to watch. Paul Smith, he's actually done fairly well in his career, for a guy whose best win is Tony Dodson. Paul Smith, he's had a lot of fights at world title level or against top quality opposition. Andre Ward, De Gale, Groves, Arthur Abraham 1, Arthur Abraham 2, Tyrone Zeuge. I'm probably forgetting other fights he's had. But there's one thing in common. Whenever he's stepped up to anything remotely like that level, he's lost. And he's lost with, by quite a bit, actually. Smith's one of these guys who, he's probably a British level fighter. As I say, his best win's Tony Dodson. He doesn't even have a Rocky Fielding or a Jamie Cox or anyone like that on his resume. His best win is Tony Dodson, But by longevity in the game, by his TV work, he's managed to get himself to a position where he's seen as a vet. He's kind of established as a name. He's kind of established as a world title opponent. And it's allowed him to get these big fights regularly and hopefully get some decent paydays out of it. But where he's at this stage, it's kind of hard to see him it's kind of hard to see him really winning a big fight again. And you wonder now whether his best bet may be to focus on his punditry. He's not bad as a pundit. Focus on the punditry. Focus on his work with Sky. Maybe support his brothers. But it seems that the dream of getting a world title for Paul Smith at least has disappeared for now. Whether he wants to drop to British level and fight a John Ryder and an Adam Etches and a Fielding or Cox, those fights are available to him, I'm sure, if he wants it. But for me, I question whether the ambition's there at this stage of the game for him. As for Tyrone Zeuge, he looked okay. He looked like he's improved a bit. He's only 25. Nice jab. That impressed me about him. Nice jab and relatively solid in terms of the way he was keeping distance and the way he was trying to avoid Smith's haymakers. Relatively solid without really looking spectacular and without really giving the impression that he was a particularly exciting fighter en route to the very top of the game. 168. It's maybe gone through a little bit of a spell of being slightly lighter, but now starting to look stronger again. You've got guys like Ramirez, Benavidez, guys like George Groves, De Gale, Durrell. There's a few names. Obviously, Callum Smith coming through. And is he on the level of those guys? Possibly not from what I've seen from him. But, he's still improving and we'll have to see. We'll have to see where he goes from there. Don't be surprised if he pops up in the WBA tournament. Understand George Groves is going to go in that tournament potentially. And obviously Zeuge works with the Sauerlands. So don't be surprised if he goes down that route. Let me know your thoughts on this video, guys. Drop your comments in the section below. If you've enjoyed it, hit the thumbs up. Do subscribe to the channel. But let's discuss Ward Kovalev, let's discuss Smith Zeuge, and yeah, thanks for watching as always.